Welcome to the Real True American Patriot. We are reclaiming patriotism from the far right, who appropriated it for their own narrow nationalist interests, just in time for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Republic. Americans never fail to amaze me. Many of us are opposed to the U.S. helping Ukraine defend itself from Russia. Others are even rooting for Russia to conquer Ukraine. It's breaking my brain. This is Russia we are talking about. Remember Russia? Our erstwhile, as in longtime, mortal enemy. Yes, much of that hostility was Red Scare, Red Menace stuff, including huge exaggeration by the CIA of the Soviet nuclear weapon stockpile. And I always longed for and appreciated the occasional detente or thaw in the icy relations between the then Soviet Union and the U.S., such as the Reagan-Gorbachev summits. We will circle back to that. First, let's address that strange subset of MAGA Americans rooting for Russia who will call American supporters of Ukraine commies. They call American supporters of Ukraine commies. I shouldn't have to say this, but it used to be Russians, and before that, citizens of the Soviet Union, the home of communism, who were the commies. And obviously derogatory term. It also referred to Americans who supported the then Soviet Union. You know, pinkos and the like. But for MAGA, the association with Russia has been completely stripped out of the word communist. No more Russia in communist. On July 4th, Trump said, quote, "Our warriors did not fight communism, only to have that menace rear its ugly head right back here in America." The only wars that the U.S. fought against communism were the Korean War and the Vietnam War, the latter a stain on America's soul. In fact, though, for Trump and MAGA, there is nothing Russia about communism. The word has morphed into serving as a general insult for Democrats and people perceived as liberal. As if the ranks are seething with Marxists. In part, though, the recent success of the Democratic Socialist Party has provided an opening for Trump and MAGA to levy the communist charge. Well, but how many Democratic Socialists have you ever met? About as many as people who describe themselves as Antifa. For me, a longtime leftist, the total zero is zero. Total is zero on each count. Zero. Zero. You get it? Zero. Officially after 1991, when the Soviet Union disbanded, Russia has no longer been officially communist. It is now capitalist, though in a highly corrupt form that is often called state, crony, or oligarchic capitalism. Kind of like the U.S. under Trump is becoming. Yes, we are becoming state, crony, or oligarchic capitalism, or we have already become it. Speaking of Trump, a few short years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia returned to its default setting, an all-powerful leader, Putin. Also kind of like the U.S. with Trump. Meanwhile, Putin is viewed favorably by those same American Trump supporters who oppose U.S. aid to Ukraine or actively root for Russia. How did they get to that place? Well, if you like someone such as Trump, what's to stop you from liking Putin? They admire Putin because they view him as nationalistic, religious, traditional, and, drumroll please, opposed to wokeness. They want to be asleep. They don't want their eyes open. Sorry, don't let me get going here. Here's what those who support Russia and Putin don't realize. Russia, while not officially communist, is more Soviet than ever. Its leader is more Soviet than any leader since Stalin. In a 2005 speech, Putin actually said, open quote, "The demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, close quote. Of course, for most people, they thought it was the greatest thing that happened in the century. For those who sleep through history class, assuming this is even taught anymore, Soviet is actually worse than communist. Among other things, it means authoritarian rule, secret police, surveillance, censorship, propaganda, and punishment of dissent. You know, gulags, all that fun stuff. And last but not least, expansionism and domination, to some extent anyway, same as it ever was for Russia. Even many American men my age who grow up on our own form of propagandizing about the Red Menace and the evil empire, as I just mentioned, romanticize Putin because they think he embodies manliness. I guess those photos of him riding a horse while shirtless makes them feel all tingly. Okay, whatever turns you on. Remind me again why Putin started this war. Now seems like a good time to revisit that. What with 350,000 to 500,000 Russian military deaths in the war? Those poor schmucks. I saw this quote in Foreign Policy magazine about Russian soldiers deployed to Ukraine. Open quote. The average life expectancy of a new recruit from arrival at a training ground to death in the combat zone, from arrival at a training ground to death in the combat zone, lies somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks. Once they are sent onto the battlefield, Russian fighters survive an average of 20 to 35 minutes. Say that again. This is from Foreign Policy magazine. Once they are sent onto the battlefield, Russian fighters survive an average of 25 to 30 minutes. Close quote. I mean, this is the 20th century. Who still wages war like that? Not Ukraine, which, whenever possible, lets its drones and missiles, and robot trucks, robot vehicles do the talking. The Russian military, when it comes to tactics anyway, is still mired in the 20th century when it sent waves of soldiers against the German Wehrmacht army to the tune of 8.5 to 11 million members of the Russian military killed. That's right, in a Great Patriotic War, as the Russian called it. You can still say that they were mainly responsible for winning World War II. They lost 8.5 to 11 million members of the military and many more civilians. Again, I ask, you think they'd got kind of tired of all the deaths by then? Again, I ask, why a war? From the point of view of Russia, or should I say Putin, I will tell you, with my reactions to each ostensible reason. 1. Ukraine was leaving Russia's sphere of influence in favor of Europe and the West. Me to Putin. None. No. That none. Me to Putin. Ukraine was leaving Russia's sphere of influence in favor of Europe and the West. Me to Putin. None of your business. 2. Growing close to NATO, Ukraine was becoming a military threat to Russia. Me to Putin. In what world would NATO attack Russia? 3. Unless it was in self-defense. 3. It is incumbent on Russia to protect Russia-speaking populations in eastern Ukraine. Me to Putin. From what threat exactly? 4. The unity of Ukraine and Russia was critical to rebuilding Russian power. Me to Putin. That's great for your fantasy life, but never mind Ukrainians, it would do nothing to benefit the Russian people either. To elaborate, Putin has repeatedly argued that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. It is true that both Russians and Ukrainians trace part of their heritage to a medieval state called Kievan Rus, encompassing present-day Kiev. Ukraine generally rejects this as simplistic. Worse, between the 17th and 19th centuries, much of Ukraine was swallowed up by Russia, and it discouraged Ukraine's distinctive language and culture. Eventually, Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union. But Ukraine voted for independence, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the rest is history. Ukraine became independent. Many Russians felt as if a branch had been sawed off their tree. Oh. Many Americans think that Ukraine should make concessions to Russia to end the war. Some think the U.S. should not be spending taxpayer money to help other countries when there are so many problems in the U.S. There's going to be a lot more problems if Russia got much stronger. Other Americans actually think Putin was justified in invading Ukraine. Still others suffering from an acute sense of whataboutism. Wonder why Russia is condemned for violating the sovereignty of Ukraine when the U.S. has made a career out of intervention in other countries. Worst of all are the Putin fanboys alluded to above. Worst of all are the Putin fanboys alluded to above. Anyway, Americans opposed to or indifferent to Ukraine seem unacquainted with one of the most horrifying episodes in human history. In an aside, I am giving them the benefit of the doubt here. If they actually are familiar with this story, let's be clear. They suffer from an utter lack of humanity. What I am referring to is the other hollow besides the Holocaust, the Holodomor. Holodomor comes from the Ukrainian words halad, hunger, and moriti, to kill or cause death. In other words, Holodomor means death by starvation or murder by hunger. Okay. Recently, I read Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, a 2017 book by Anne Applebaum, a noted journalist and author. The Holodomor, of course, was a famine in Soviet Ukraine between 1932 and 1933 that killed between 3.5 and 5 million people. However odd it sounds, the Soviet leader, Stalin, engineered the famine of citizens under his own rule, citizens who were not even mounting a resistance. The Holodomor is often explained as the result of Stalin's attempts to transform Soviet agriculture through something called collectivization. The program forced individual farmers or peasants onto state-controlled collective farms, which meant that nothing, including equipment and livestock, was owned by individual farmers, and the harvest was divided up. Alas, that doesn't mean the harvest was apportioned to the farmers on the collective. Much of it was appropriated by the state, and whatever was left was distributed among the individual farmers on the collective. Recipe for resentment, right? What was the point of such an inherently inflammatory policy? Well, Stalin thought collectivization would increase grain production to feed growing cities and factory workers. He also wanted to sell grain to foreign countries and use the funds to buy industrial equipment. With Stalin, agriculture was always in service to manufacturing. In fact, Stalin never tired of persecuting peasant farmers known as kulaks. He was obsessed with them, some of whom may have been wealthy, but most of whom had simply managed to attain a measure of success beyond the subsistence level of most farmers in Ukraine. It was a far cry from the romanticized farming scenes in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Remember those? As we shall see, none of this worked for Ukrainian peasants, who began to starve en masse. What's more, in the 1920s, Ukraine had been experiencing a revival of its language and culture, resulting in national pride. Stalin in turn feared that Ukraine would break away from the Soviet Union. Besides inducing a famine, Soviet authorities also cracked down on Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, clergy, and political leaders. I mean the part of them that wasn't destroyed by hunger. Stalin combined narcissism and paranoia with revolutionary ideology that justified violence in pursuit of political goals. We all know that, right? Anybody who knows anything about Russia knows that. Constantly suspicious of friends and allies, he had an obsessive need for loyalty, and in true paranoid fashion often interpreted innocent actions as betrayal. In an aside, recall that he followed up the Red Famine, the Holodomor, with the purges of his own military and civilians in the 30s. Even more people were killed then, I think. In the same vein, he interpreted any resistance on the part of Soviet peasants as political sabotage rather than their own economic self-interest, aka, in this instance, mere survival. Yes, their own economic self-interest was tantamount to mere survival. Stalin had many Ukrainian peasants killed. Others were imprisoned in the Soviet Union or transported to factories in places such as Siberia. Adding insult to injury, the Soviet government not only refused to let citizens leave Ukraine, it restricted travel within Ukraine, blocking starving peasants from wandering the countryside in search of food. Especially cruel, while people starved, Russia continued exporting grain to generate funds to buy machinery and technology from abroad. But when it comes to sadism, nothing compares to Soviet confiscation of all the peasants' own food, presumably on the principle they could get by on the food the collectives gave them, which was often nothing, next to nothing, or if they weren't yet part of collectives, no food at all. The zeal with which teams or brigades, as they called them, of the local Communist Party members, village officials, and police interpreted Stalin and the Soviet Central Committee's directives, the zeal with which teams or brigades, as they call them, of local Communist Party members, village officials, and police interpreted Stalin and the Soviet Central Committee's directives is unlike anything that I'm aware of in all recorded history. May have happened, probably did, but on this scale, don't think so. These teams conducted house-to-house searches in a way that to this day strains credulity. It's incomprehensible. Here is what they did. They searched for food in every room, from the kitchen to the pantry, to the attic, to the cellar, inspecting every cabinet and drawer. They probed earthen floors in search of buried food, such as grain or potatoes. They dismantled structures such as barns if they suspected food was hidden inside. Gardens, haystacks, and animal pens were searched for buried sacks of grain. Beyond grain, foodstuffs such as flour, root vegetables, dried beans, and lard were taken. Livestock and poultry were seized. If, on the odd chance, food was simmering on the stove, officials confiscated that. Beds, clothes, and furniture were searched for concealed grain. Venturing even further into the realm of the absurd, brigade members were even picking grain from cracks in the floor. But it gets worse. Under something called the Law of 5 Years of Grain, peasants could be sentenced to long prison terms or even executed for collecting small amounts of grain left over in the fields of the collective after harvest. Think about it. All food, no matter how tiny the quantity, had become state property. Oh my God. Rather than provide emergency aid to the starving, Stalin continued to collect and also export grain while in denial about the famine. Kind of short-sighted to disable the operation of one of the main breadbaskets of the Soviet Union, of the world, it still is, don't you think? This may be a cliche, but I have never heard it before. ChatGPT spewed it out at me. Open quote. The hallmark of totalitarianism is that it turns policies into crimes and crimes into policies. Or, as with Trump and Putin, totalitarianism turns politicians into criminals and criminals into politicians. Anyway, Ms. Applebaum argues that these criminal policies used famine as an assault on the Ukrainians and their identity as such, both their bodies and them as a people. In other words, genocide. The famine finally ended when members of the Soviet Central Committee issued a decree to provide food aid. Why did they finally do that? Not because of humanitarian concerns, which were as foreign to the Soviet government then as they are to the Russian government now. Remember, Stalin was a man whose son, an officer in the Red Army during World War II, was captured by the German Wehrmacht army. Stalin disowned his son partly because he regarded the surrender required to be captured as treason, and his son subsequently died in a concentration camp. The actual reason Stalin finally allowed food was because Soviet prisons were overflowing with Ukrainians. They were too crowded, and because of the inevitable, he needed help with the harvest. That constituted a belated acknowledgement that starving farmers to death meant little to no farming. The final outcome of the Holodomor, out of a population of 31 million Americans, 4 Ukrainians, 4 million deaths. There will be no treaty to end the current Ukraine war. More likely, we will see what's called a frozen conflict. The fighting largely stops, but no peace treaty is signed. Russia would stop launching drones and missiles at Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian dwellings, with an emphasis on the civilians. On the ground in eastern Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine would remain on opposite sides of the current front line. Meanwhile, both sides would continue to claim the disputed territory. Disputed territory. That just means Ukraine's territory that Russia has taken and that Ukraine wants back. Peace treaty, ceasefire, frozen conflict. All of it really means is that Russia is just flipping the hourglass until it has its forces and armaments built back up. Then, a few years down the line, it will resume its attacks on Ukraine. I will leave you with this. If your country had gone through an experience like the Holodomor or the Red Famine at the hands of another country, as Ukraine has with Russia, would you ever trust that country again to uphold its end of an agreement? No, you would not.